1. Fortune-telling. June in London warmed slowly into summer. On the south bank of the Thames, outside Cheltenham College Primary School, the 4 o'clock bell had just rung. Children spilled out of the gate in a rush of noise and laughter. Under the shade of a tree near the entrance, a boy sat with a small folding stool and a pair of dice. "Miss Winnie, the results show it's highly unlikely you'll find the love you're hoping for before graduation," he said, glancing at the numbers on the dice and offering a sheepish smile. The girl's face fell. "I won't find it? All right, thank you for the reading, Mr. Swinburne." She dropped a pound into his hand and turned away without argument. Perhaps the answer wasn't a surprise. Her proper upbringing kept her from making a scene. The boy, who the children called Mr. Swinburne, tucked the coin away with practiced ease, bent to pick up his dice, and sat back on his stool, waiting for the next customer. Some say graduation season in June is all about parting and sorrow, but of course there are exceptions. It's finally over. The bell for the last class echoed behind her, and Hermione quickly shoved books into her satchel and left without looking back. There wasn't a trace of reluctance on her face. Unlike most people, graduation felt like freedom. Freedom from those classmates who seemed dim at first glance and somehow worse up close. She walked along the familiar path with her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if nothing around her could touch her. The posture looked oddly out of place among the noisy groups spilling from the school, but she didn't hold it long. The moment she stepped through the gate, something in her relaxed. Her gaze drifted automatically to the tree opposite, and there he was, the same figure she'd seen so often. A small, involuntary smile curved her lips. Then she noticed him smiling and talking with a sturdy, laughing girl. The smile died on her face. "He's supposed to love reading so much, and yet he goes around fleecing girls," Hermione muttered, annoyed. Her dislike had started 2 years earlier, when a boy who called himself a diviner began appearing near local primary schools on weekends. He would set up just outside the gates, use a single die to read fortunes, and earn the pupils' pocket money. Many praised the accuracy of his readings. Hermione called it luck, or simple probability. She had never paid for a reading herself. The idea of divining the future with one die struck her as foolish. Only the truly gullible would buy it. "He's just using his looks to con infatuated girls," she decided, but she stayed to watch for a beat, satisfied in her judgment, before heading home. Light filtered through the leaves. The boy sat on his stool as speckled sun fell across his face. His amber eyes caught the light and looked almost crystalline. They had an infantile innocence to them, clean, bright, impossible to hold a grudge against. His short dark hair shone like polished obsidian in the sun. After a while, he watched the school gate, gathered his few belongings, an old folding stool and a yellowed linen cloth, and slung a small canvas bag over his shoulder. The shell wine chimes tied to it tinkled as he walked away. Half an hour later, he came back to his home, a natural arch under a Thames bridge. He carried 2 bags of food and sat, rolling the same dice between his fingers. 3 months, he murmured, counting the days. It's almost time for the next crossing. He wasn't from here. He was a transmigrant from a far eastern land who had woken up in England as an abandoned infant. After 10 years in the orphanage, a strange thing happened on his 10th birthday. He found he could slip into other worlds. Since then, every once in a while, he would wake not in his London life, but within some legend, fairy tale, or folk tale come to life. The journeys were unpredictable, sometimes separated by a week or two, sometimes by months. Sometimes he stayed in those worlds only a couple of weeks, sometimes up to half a year. There were no missions, no systems, no plot he had to follow. He was always a spectator, passing through other people's stories. The randomness of his travel was maddening at times. Once, as a child, he'd opened a bathroom door and stepped straight into an immense jungle. Yet those strange trips had one undeniable advantage. He learned things, and the old dice became useful. Over 2 years of voyages and experiments, he'd worked out enough rules to take advantage of the worlds he visited. He treated his ability like a travel agency or a life experience program, an avenue to live comfortably. After that first journey, he'd chosen to leave the orphanage. Journeys could last months. If he kept disappearing for long stretches, people would notice the changes a growing boy would show. Worse, an orphan with no power or protection might be taken advantage of. Fate had its own mercy, though. Time in the two spaces behaved differently. No matter how long he stayed in a fantasy world, only an instant passed in his London life. As a result, he accumulated years of experience and travel while remaining physically a child, still looking about 11, so no one realized anything had changed. That paradox let him live how he wanted. When his money ran low, he went to nearby primary schools and told fortunes to earn pocket money. When he wanted to keep learning, he prowled London's libraries and bookshops. The dice, the stool, the little performances, everything fit neatly into a comfortable, if peculiar, life. He smiled at the thought and rolled the dice again, waiting and counting the days until the next strange doorway opened. 2. Letter from an Owl, London, on the banks of the Thames. The gentle river moved quietly, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves on either side, bringing a calm, lazy quality to the summer afternoon. It's fish and chips again. By the river, not far from a bridge pier and half hidden by a tangle of bushes, intermittent complaints were audible. Eno expertly opened the paper bag. He grumbled about the monotony and meanness of the meal, but his hands never stopped. He tore off a piece of golden, crispy fish and ate it in big bites. Compared to luxury dishes like beef Wellington or Cornish pasties, fish and chips could fill you up for £1, the most economical choice for someone on his budget. After polishing off the last piece and taking a long, satisfied swallow from his water bottle, he leaned back against the bridge pier. Some people resist loneliness. Others enjoy it. But loneliness always implies survival. Like sheep and rabbits, if you can't survive on your own, you won't dare to taste solitude. Under the pier, Eno stared at factories in the distance, smoke curling into the sky, and let his thoughts wander. London in '91. The big event I remember is that scarred boy getting his letter on Privet Drive. The stray image made him chuckle at himself. Eno sometimes wondered if transmigrators were really protagonists. If he were one, he'd be a poor show. Unlike novel heroes who start businesses at 3 and trade futures at 5, he'd spent 10 years simply trying to belong in this unfamiliar country. Investments, shorting currencies, none of that was in his world. It was a blunt, practical truth. A person's future is often set by their origin. Without a supporting background, even a lucky gain makes you someone else's wallet. Eno accepted that. People who'd never succeeded before would likely fail again, even if given another shot. Success depended less on opportunity and more on the source code you were born with. Like a Steinway piano, if your family never owned one, you probably never would. Mediocrity isn't a crime, he muttered. Thanks to London's temperate climate, extremes of heat were rare. Even in June, 93.2 degrees Fahrenheit was about the upper limit. Time had slipped by, and the afternoon nap was in full swing when a rustling sound jolted him awake. After 11 years in the city, he could tell quickly when something was off. He assumed it was a common bird: pigeon, turtle-dove, raven. His mind was awake, but his eyes stubbornly refused to open. He lazily raised an arm to shoo the intruder away. Years of drifting had taught him that a casual wave sent timid birds scattering. This time, the gesture failed. The bird didn't flee. Instead, Eno felt his fingers being pecked. Annoyed, he sat up and snapped. "What, you want me to make you part of my lunch?" "Ah!" He opened his eyes, and the curse on his own words cut off mid-sentence. Before him perched an innocent-looking gray and white scops owl, a pudgy little English owl, all-round face and soft feathers. That would have been enough to stop him, but the right leg was bound with a small, rolled letter sealed in wax. For a second, he thought it was a prank. What a classic image: a boy, an owl, a sealed envelope. But excitement and a little apprehension took over. He untied the letter, broke the seal, and read carefully. "Dear Mr. Swinburne, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The term begins on September 1st, 1991. Sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress." Those familiar names answered his unspoken questions. It was 1991 in England, years before the Wizarding World books took the world by storm. At this point, Rowling might still be on a train in Manchester, meeting the thin, black-haired boy who sparked her idea. Eno murmured, tucking the envelope away. He'd nearly ruled out a prank entirely. Who would bother to train an owl just to tease a wandering orphan? and the name and address matched. But another worry niggled him. In a decade living here, he hadn't felt any tremors of magic. Could it be a misdelivery? He shook his head. A Muggle school might misaddress a letter, but Hogwarts? If the acceptance book and quill made mistakes, the whole wizarding system would be in chaos. The owl watched him with bright, beady eyes, taking in his shabby clothes and thin frame. It didn't hop forward begging for food. Its round face had something almost contemplative about it, as if weighing whether to hunt a few mice to leave for the boy. After all, a young wizard getting into Hogwarts only to starve would be a worrying sight. 10 minutes later, having received no reply, the little owl took off and vanished into the clouds. All plans are disrupted, Eno said to himself, rubbing his temple helplessly. The moment the Hogwarts letter sank in, childish excitement surged alongside the old, familiar joy of a dream coming true. But practicality returned quickly. It was 1991. Enrolling then meant his school years would be full of surprises. First year, the two-faced man. Second year, the basilisk. Third year, the dementors. Each year brought its own crisis. How great it would be to be Percy's age, or at least Fred and George's, he grumbled. Going to school with Scarhead will shorten my life. The first years could be managed with caution, but what came after the Goblet of Fire, the years of open war, Death Eaters attacking Hogwarts, couldn't be avoided merely by keeping your head down. In a battle like that, getting caught in the crossfire would be a matter of minutes. Worst case, he decided, I'll take a leave of absence in my 5th year. New book released, new journey, thanks to all new and old readers for their support. 3. Miss Rabbit Hogwarts, Principal's Office. I've already sent Hagrid to collect the child. Dumbledore removed his half-moon spectacles, produced a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and deliberately wiped away imaginary dust from the lenses. He looked at the silent figure before him, and as if following a line of thought he did not voice, his gaze drifted to the arm concealed beneath the professor's heavy robes. The dark mark. Dumbledore understood that magic better than most. The mark that should have vanished after Tom's death had inexplicably endured for 11 years, now only faint, but still there. A mark was a mark, an undeniable fact. Perhaps it meant, in some troubling way, that Tom had never truly died. This year was the year of Harry's enrollment. The boy who lived would at last walk into the world's sight. Old memories rose up in Dumbledore's mind, one by one. Severus, he said softly, after Harry is sorted, I'd like you to watch over him and help him along. At the name Harry, Snape's hard brows softened for an instant, but the change was fleeting. He soon slid back into his usual distant reserve. Dumbledore, who had lived long enough to learn the value of measured words, held his silence for a beat before letting the next point go unsaid. Finally, Snape spoke first, uncharacteristically. I am the head of Slytherin. Unless he is sorted into Slytherin, I will act only in my capacity as Potions Master. That will be sufficient, Dumbledore said with a bright laugh. Some things needed no further explanation. Mutual understanding was enough. Is that all I summoned you for? Snape's voice was as even as ever. These are the lists of young witches and wizards who will require guidance. There are quite a few new students this year. Minerva has complained more than once that we are short-handed. Dumbledore opened a nearby drawer and drew out a thick stack of parchment bound together. I need this done before term begins. Phileas and Pomona received their allocations yesterday. Snape sneered as he took the lists, but accepted them. He knew better than anyone why so many children were suddenly enrolling at Hogwarts, parents seeking connection to the boy who had survived, opportunists returning after years in hiding. He folded the parchments under his arm and offered no more comment. London Foyles. Foyles was a historic bookstore, and vast to the point of being legendary. Someone had once calculated that if its volumes were laid end to end, they would stretch for an almost terrifying 48 kilometers. With addresses spanning 84 to 125 Charing Cross Road, its scale was obvious. The staff numbered in the hundreds. On the second floor, in the Folklore and Fairy Tales section, a boy sat absorbed in a slim, battered volume of 1001 Nights. His name was Eno. For the past 2 years, he had cultivated the habit of reading obsessively. In the world he expected to enter, tales and fables mattered. Stories were performance, prophecy, and background all at once. The more he read, the more clues he collected, small hints that might in time become something like magic. He read in a bookstore because libraries required borrowing cards and deposits he, an orphan of uncertain origin, could not provide. At a place like Foyle's, no one minded a lone teenager lingering by the shelves for hours. And at last, the princess awoke, married the prince, and they lived happily ever after. Eno rubbed a stiff neck. One major drawback to reading in a shop rather than a library: no comfortable seats. Standing for an hour or two was the norm. 1,001 Nights. A book I gave up at 6. I didn't expect your tastes to be so peculiar, Mr. Liar. The clear voice behind him made Eno frown. He did not like being interrupted mid-reading. The speaker sounded his age. For the sake of appearances, and perhaps for future divination clients, he turned and forced a polite smile. I don't think no book should be judged by the age of its reader, and he broke off as he studied the girl facing him. 2 years could change someone, but not enough to erase his memory of the people he'd read for. He had never met this brown-haired girl before. Still, her 2 large, perfectly white front teeth made her instantly memorable. Since she was not a client, politeness was no longer required. Eno's tone turned blunt and sarcastic. If I remember correctly, you've never had a reading from me. Isn't it a bit hasty to judge without checking, Miss Rabbit? You, the girl flushed, both embarrassed and angry. Mocking someone's appearance is hardly gentlemanly. Eno seized on the small opening. Is giving people nicknames without consent ladylike? Hermione, because that was her name, flared up, but several deep breaths calmed her enough to stop her immediate retort. She was furious. She disliked losing an argument, especially to someone her age, and his logic left her momentarily speechless. All right, she said at last, moving to damage control. I apologize for the nickname. It was a rapid concession, better to keep the peace. She dug into her pocket and produced a single-pound coin. Here, £1. I'll pay for a reading. Will I go to Winchester College or Wycombe Abbey? Eno's expression shifted to business-like acceptance. Only a fool refused money. He took the coin without hesitation. Fine, find somewhere quiet, and I'll read for you now. He pocketed the pound. Money mattered. Books cost, and if he ever hoped to afford new volumes, he couldn't find in the Hogwarts library. Every penny helped. Half an hour later, in the 5th-floor lounge at Foyle's, the divination dice on the table spun like a wound-up top and refused to stop. This makes no sense, Eno muttered. He looked surprised but otherwise unchanged, puzzling over the problem. After a moment, he picked the dice up and scowled at the girl beside him. He'd done at least 100 divinations in the last 2 years and knew these dice inside out, 6 sides representing 0%, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. A die that could spin forever and refuse to settle meant, in effect, that the outcome was neither success nor failure, a result that should never occur. Events might be slightly biased, but never perfectly 50-50. The memory of their first meeting and the girl's earlier accusation came back to him. She hadn't been honest. She must have set up false conditions to interfere with his reading, something he'd seen before. Frustrated, he said, "Rabbit, I apologize, Miss No Name. Are you sure you'll get into those 2 schools and not someplace like Smelting's Academy? One thing you should know, idiots don't get into Cambridge or Oxford." My name is Hermione Granger, the girl snapped, and I'm absolutely certain my grades are good enough for those schools, not some second-rate academy. Hermione's indignation flared. She looked like a cat with its fur on end. Eno barely blinked. The name Hermione was too familiar. Coupled with the detail of her father's profession from the owl's letter, it clicked. He asked casually, "So your father's a dentist?" "Haven't you divined that?" "It's right, but I asked you to divine my future school," she retorted. Same name, in London, with a dentist for a father. The pieces fit. Eno was suddenly certain this was Hermione Granger, who would later be famous. He decided he ought to keep his distance. Getting close to her at Hogwarts would be like holding Harry Potter's hand, and that would only draw attention from people like Malfoy. He definitely didn't want to be tied to the Chosen One. "All right, then," Eno said curtly. "The divination says neither of those 2 schools is your future destination." He picked up the £1 note on the table and stood. Seeing the confusion on Hermione's face, he paused and added, If I'm wrong, and you do get into either of them, I'll refund you double before term starts. I'm not going to run off." Then he left. With Miss Know-It-All there, he had no intention of lingering in the bookstore. He planned to buy a few books to prepare for school and move downstairs. Hermione watched the empty chair for a long moment, feeling wronged. She stamped her foot inwardly. "You gave them a long reading, but me, only a few minutes?" On the ground floor at the till, Eno handed over £10 and bought 3 volumes of fairy tales: Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Andersen's Fairy Tales, and 1001 Nights. It was nearly noon by the time he left Foyle's, and he hurried back because the owl's letter had made one thing clear. A Hogwarts professor would visit that afternoon to help him acquire the items on his acceptance list. He couldn't miss that. Back at his lodgings, Eno passed the time reading his new purchases until the appointed hour. When his old pocket watch chimed, he snapped the book shut and scanned the room. A figure appeared out of thin air a heartbeat later. Seeing who it was made his stomach drop. Not McGonagall, as most new students expected. Instead, a tall man in a black robe with greasy hair clinging to his forehead stood in front of him. Severus Snape, Slytherin head of house and potions professor, had come. Snape's pale eyes fixed on him. Eno felt uncomfortably exposed under that steady, cold stare. What he didn't know was that when their gazes met, Snape had been pulled, involuntarily, into a cascade of images by the look in the boy's amber eyes. A shabby house on Spinner's End, a small boy clinging to his mother and begging for wizarding stories, a thin black-haired lad in a quiet park, a sweet-smiling girl with emerald eyes, memory after memory, passing through Snape's mind like a slideshow. Snape's jaw tightened. "Humph. Put away your clumsy occlumency," he snapped, his voice cold and cutting. It was as much an order as an effort to steady himself. "I am a Hogwarts professor," he went on, expression unreadable. "I was sent because your name appeared on the list of those requiring guidance. It would seem there has been an error. You do not require this guidance." "Don't require guidance?" Eno said quickly, not even thinking about the occlumency the professor had mentioned. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake. I've been homeless since I was 10. If it weren't for the school's help, I couldn't possibly buy everything I need to enroll." He spoke fast. This wasn't the time to be proud. This was Snape. If the man decided not to help, that would be that. The thought of facing Diagon Alley, wands and books to buy, with no idea where to go or the money to pay, made his palms sweat. Snape didn't turn away at once. He took in the room. A warped footbridge, a torn canvas, a second-hand folding stool. Only the aluminum kettle looked almost new. If winter came, this place would be lethal. "Pack your things and follow me," Snape said at last. He believed Eno's story, or rather he trusted his own judgment, but he was also surprised. He had initially been annoyed at the clumsy attempt at occlumency, yet now he realized it wasn't simple concealment. This boy's mind was skilled enough to make a voyeur see what he subconsciously wanted to see. Snape's eyes narrowed the tiniest fraction. This was more interesting than he'd expected. 5. The story of the magic wand and the elder mother Diagon Alley. Cobblestones underfoot, strange shops lining either side. No book or film could fully capture the place. Magic here was varied and marvelous, but Eno paid it little mind as he trailed obediently behind Snape. He was curious by nature, but he knew he was not with the kindly Hagrid or the responsible Professor McGonagall. This was Severus Snape. Getting everything done quickly and correctly was the priority. He had already memorized the route, and there were almost 2 months before term started. He could return later and explore at leisure. Leaving Gringotts, Eno held a small cloth pouch that contained 20 galleons, the full amount of the financial aid Hogwarts gave new students. It wasn't free. When he signed for it, he had seen the agreement. The aid was essentially an interest-free loan that had to be repaid within 3 years of graduation. Even so, it genuinely helped many students. He turned to Snape. "Professor, what should we do next?" Snape corrected him flatly. "It's you, not us." His tone did not invite further conversation. "Take your money and buy the things on your list. My responsibility was to bring you to Diagon Alley and make sure you received this money." Eno rubbed the ache in his cheek. Holding a cheerful, innocent expression for hours left his face stiff. He tried to smile anyway. How had he offended this man? He had black hair but not emerald green eyes. He wasn't sure what he had done. For now, he could only accept it. Snape had fulfilled his professorial duty, at least in that narrow sense, and Eno trusted he wouldn't lie about such things. As they stood in front of Gringotts, Snape's earlier remark, something about clumsy occlumency, flashed through his mind. If Snape disdained lies, he would not mention something meaningless. He had said occlumency. Eno thought of the disguise he'd adopted to survive in a world of magic, putting on the face of an innocent, kind child. Fairy tales, legends, and folk stories tended to follow one principle: kind children stay safe. Even if they face hardships, they find a way through. That logic had shaped his act. The occlumency comment might be connected, or it might be only a fragment. There were too few clues to know for sure. Forget it, he decided. He would check the library after he enrolled if he couldn't puzzle it out now. There were other things to do. 15 minutes later, he left a second-hand shop, a decent cauldron, and some glass bottles tucked into his bag. He had asked the shopkeeper for directions to Ollivander's and walked briskly, heart light at the thought of getting his first wand. Soon he stood before the small, time-worn shop whose name he'd seen in so many books, Ollivander's. The gold letters on the sign were flaking, but the inscription was legible enough. Ollivander's, makers of fine wands, since 382 BC. This is where the stories begin, he thought, then pushed the door open. Inside was smaller than it looked from the street, narrow, cramped, older than it had any right to be. Wands lay on faded purple cushions, and thousands more were boxed away on shelves that climbed toward the ceiling. The place had the hush of something very old and secret. "Good afternoon." A new face, came a gentle voice. Eno looked up at an elderly man with shoulder-length messy silver hair and startlingly bright eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," Eno answered politely. "I'd like to find a wand, if you can help me." Of course, all the young wizards who come every summer are looking for the same thing. Mr. Ollivander smiled as he substituted find for choose. "Which hand do you use to hold a wand?" he asked, rolling up a sleeve and picking up a tape measure from the corner. "Right hand," Eno said, offering his arm. He never quite understood these measurements, but he complied. As Mr. Ollivander took measurements, he spoke of his philosophy. Many believed a wizard chose a wand, but truly, the wand chose the wizard. Eno didn't let the matter rest there. He had read a lot in the last 2 years and loved stories. "I agree," he said. "It's like the story of the elder mother. To some, they're just trees, but to others, they're living, kind spirits." "Older mother?" Mr. Ollivander paused, looking intrigued. "A muggle tale, is it? Do tell." Eno obliged. He told the simple, vivid tale from Anderson's collection. A naughty little boy breaks his leg and refuses the bitter elderberry medicine his mother offers. Suddenly, the elderberry in his bowl grows into a towering tree. A green-skinned woman emerges from its branches, and the tree lifts them both into the sky. The boy clings to a branch in terror. When the growth stops, he finds himself in a beautiful land of singing birds. The branch in his hand has become a lovely young girl. He falls in love. She plucks a flower and places it on his head, promising him eternal life. They marry among the animals and have a clever child. One day their child is hurt and must take elderberry medicine. The boy remembers everything, his home, his mother, and the dream ends. He wakes once more as the injured child and this time swallows the bitter potion. The story was short but evocative. Mr. Ollivander listened in silence. When Eno finished, the old man's hands came together in a small, delighted clap. "A wonderful tale," Mr. Ollivander said, eyes alight. "Yes, they are all alive. Elder, rowan, apple, vine. Each wood has a character. Wands are made from them, and I have never doubted that they feel and choose. Stories like that remind you there is a life in wood and a life in wands." His voice carried a quiet conviction that made the shop feel even older, as if the shelves themselves were listening. "I didn't say I wouldn't give you money," Eno muttered as he stood inside Ollivander's wand shop. The little room felt oddly claustrophobic. The old man with silver hair seemed halfway lost in his own world, muttering and fidgeting as he moved around the displays. At the doorway, Eno had to call out to get his attention. "Sir, if possible, I'd like to get my own wand as soon as you can." Ollivander glanced through the display window and noticed the people waiting politely outside. "Ah, sorry, child. This is good." He didn't waste another second. He resumed the interrupted measurements with brisk efficiency, from shoulder to fingertip, wrist to elbow, shoulder to floor, even around Eno's head. The enchanted tape measure slipped up and down in a steady mechanical rhythm. When he finished, Ollivander turned and stared into Eno's amber eyes for a long moment. Then, a little shyly, he said, "Try this one. Elder Wand, Phoenix Feather Core, 12 inches, reasonably flexible. Well, when you were telling your story just now, it reacted the most. I think you two will be a good match." The wand was beautiful. Unlike the rugged, heavily knotted elder wands told of in tales, this one's raised grains were subtle and evenly spaced, like little white gems embedded along the shaft. It felt delicate and smooth in his hand, with a faint, comforting warmth. But none of those things mattered as much as what happened the instant he gripped it. A soft emerald light shimmered at the tip, and a small white flower, 6 petals, like a miniature blossom unique to elder wands, quietly unfurled. It wasn't the boisterous, insistent kind of response Harry's wand had once shown. This wand was almost bashful, expressing itself in the smallest of gestures, reserved and gentle. "Excellent," Ollivander cried, too loudly. The suddenness startled Eno. By the time he blinked, the little flower had already faded. "I knew you two would be a match. It seemed very pleased when it listened to your story." Ollivander warmed to his subject, launching into one of his characteristic monologues about wand lore. Eno rolled his eyes inwardly. He admitted the wand felt right, like an old friend reuniting, but he didn't sense anything like intelligence or a talking spirit. Sensing a long speech coming, he opted for a joke. If it's that happy, does that mean I can take it for free?" he said brightly. Ollivander blinked. The shopkeeper who'd inherited the business and its traditions for decades seemed momentarily dumbfounded. "Ahem, that's not how it works," he said at last. "Compatibility means a wand has found its owner, not that you can have it gratis." Then, as if afraid of being taken advantage of, he hurried on before Eno could answer. 7 galleons, please. Remember, that's the starting price. Take good care of it." All right, I never said I wouldn't pay," Eno replied, opening his coin pouch with a rueful smile. Outside, walking away from the shop with the wand tucked into his coat, a quiet, inexplicable satisfaction filled him. Owning a real wand was something he'd never dared hope for. Now that it had happened, the happiness was simple and whole. After 2 lifetimes' worth of wandering, Eno had learned that comfort and wealth weren't the root of happiness. Hope was. Even during the rough 2 years before, when he had no fixed roof and ate cheaply, it was the belief that something more exciting might lie ahead that made the difference. Small things, cold bridges to sleep under, cheap meals, had become part of the adventure, decorative details in a life he chose to hope in. Now, holding the wand, that same hope warmed him. He strolled down the cobbled street toward his next stop, Flourish and Blots. He had no interest in second-hand textbooks. Learning magic wasn't like skimming fairy tales. Missing pages or doodled margins could cost more than embarrassment. Textbooks and wands needed to be new. He'd already worked the numbers. The 20 galleons Hogwarts provided would cover most of what he needed, everything except an owl. Flourish and Blots sat a little further down Diagon Alley, its new signboard and wide doorway promising brisk trade. The place was a favorite among witches and wizards, and it showed. Stepping inside, there was a warm blend of oak and paper, the faint tang of ink in the air. 2 small ornamental magical plants flanked the entrance, their leaves moving ever so slightly as if to greet visitors. The shop was dim, but the clear afternoon sun slanted through old leaded window panes, throwing bands of light over the rows of shelves and highlighting the books on display. A corpulent, somewhat greasy man with deep-set eyes, he looked as if he'd come from farther afield than Britain, appeared behind the counter. "Welcome to Flourish and Blots," he said smoothly. "Do you need Hogwarts textbooks? First year? Second year? We have full sets here, or individual volumes if that's what you want. Textbooks are in the front. Other categories are on the back shelves." "Sir, I need the complete set of first-year Hogwarts textbooks," Eno said. He followed the man's gesture to the prominent central display. Rows upon rows of new books stood in neat ranks. The History of Magic, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the Standard Book of Spells, Grades 1 through 4, 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi, Magical Drafts and Potions, the Dark Forces, a guide to self-protection. Hundreds, if not thousands, of freshly printed volumes were stacked and shelved, their spines bright and unmarked. Nearby, a small placard announced a recent release and noted that signed copies were available. The shop smelled of new paper and the promise of a new beginning. 7. Magic Bloom's dusk had just arrived, the first wash of evening settling on the horizon. It felt like witnessing daylight die rather than night being born. At that thin seam between light and dark, Eno walked alone down Diagon Alley. Perhaps because it was summer vacation, the street was still lively even as evening fell. The crowd was a colorful mix, robes and pointed hats everywhere, the occasional suit-clad muggle not seeming out of place. Lining the street were the familiar, peculiar shops: Gringotts, Elop's Owl Emporium, Flourish and Blots, Florian Fortescue's Ice Cream Parlor, Pottage's Cauldron Shop, and more. The setting sun made everything look both mysterious and magical. Places he had known before now revealed themselves anew. Some things really had to be seen in person to be appreciated. Eno stopped and let himself take it in. The summer when the crumbling brick wall on the screen had split open had also opened a path to that strange world for many young wizards. Maybe then, the seed of magic had quietly been planted inside him. Time to go back, he told himself. He cast one last look at the bustling street and retraced his steps. He knew that even in peacetime, a young wizard wandering alone at night could be inviting trouble. No matter how prosperous a place seemed, there was always a shadow beneath it. That Diagon Alley linked off to Nocturne Alley had never felt like a coincidence. Fog always rose faintly over London at night. By the River Thames, beneath a secluded bridge, Eno was getting dinner ready. He reheated the leftover fried fish over a small stove, then tossed some black tea into an aluminum kettle. When everything was ready, he leaned against one of the bridge's piers to rest. 4 sickles and 5 nuts. I need to find a way to make some money, he muttered, staring at the few sad coins in his hand. Money always seemed to vanish, no matter where he was. Today's shopping had eaten through the 20 galleons he'd received from Hogwarts. Even then, he'd bought many things secondhand: the cauldron, robes, glass bottles, even half a bottle of ink. He couldn't help smiling at the memory of the stationer's face when he'd asked for only half a bottle of ink. When Eno explained that adding water would make it go further, the owner had looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "It'll make the color lighter," he'd said, but it saved at least 5 nuts. He rolled a few silver sickles between his fingers and thought about ways to earn money. Treasure hunts and fairy tales were tempting, but he'd learned from stories that greed rarely ends well. Fantasy lands rewarded good character and punished greed. If you were kind, help would come to you, but if you were avaricious, misfortune could strike at any moment. So he ruled out chasing legends. Only divination is left, he realized. Whenever divination came to mind, he thought of the man who had given him the dice, the Bard. When Eno first crossed into that other world, terrified and uncertain, he'd followed a seemingly kind bard for protection. He'd apprenticed to him without pay for months, but the experience had been invaluable. Together, they'd traveled to several towns, and the bard had taught him how to survive there by appearing kind and harmless. When they parted, the bard had given him a precious gift, a 6-sided die blessed by the goddess of fortune for divination. More than the die, Eno treasured the bard's lesson. Remember this: everything you desire controls you. When you stop wanting, you own the world. That saying had guided him for 2 years and had saved him from many dangers. He thought of the somewhat mysterious middle-aged man with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Hans," he murmured. The kettle whistled, pulling him back to the present. He poured the tea, the alcove under the bridge filled with its fresh aroma. Fish and bread, a pot of plain black tea, simple, but tonight's dinner. After he ate, he dug into his shopping bag and pulled out a thick book, Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 by Miranda Goshawk. He'd chosen it carefully. Compared to flashy subjects like transfiguration or potions, he believed spells were the foundation of magic. The rest were merely icing. More importantly, he wanted to learn a couple of simple spells quickly in case another transmigration came. He thought about the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy and the Trace. In the original story, Hermione had practiced spells before school and hadn't received any warnings from the Ministry. Perhaps the trace only activated once a young wizard enrolled at Hogwarts. He opened the spellbook and was pleasantly surprised at how friendly it was. The first-year curriculum covered only 7 spells. Aside from the levitation charm, which needed some finesse, the others, Alohomora, the softening charm, the fire-making spell, a basic healing charm, were simple enough to learn by following the steps. Of course, that was only the beginning. A healing spell, for example, grew more complex year by year. A candle burned quietly in the bridge alcove, casting a faint light over the pages. Under that dim glow, he concentrated on the text. 2 hours later, he tried the incantation aloud. Incendio! A tiny flame wavered at the tip of the elder wand, then was snuffed by a gentle gust. Even that faint spark thrilled him. This is magic, he whispered, stroking the gnarled elder wood of the wand with reverent fingers. Through the canvas covering the alcove, the flicker of his small success danced in the gloom, the start of a new journey. Chapter 8. Enter the Fantasy World, again London, South Kensington. Hermione was showing her family her new school uniform, a plain black robe and a pointed black wizard's hat. "Is this frog alive?" she asked. Unlike Hermione, who was delighted with the clothes, Mr. Granger was far more interested in the hopping chocolate frog. He sat on the sofa, staring at it for almost 15 minutes. "Dad, it's just a chocolate," Hermione said. "Maybe the magic makes it move for a while, but it's meant to be eaten." Mr. Granger pursed his lips and glanced at the only confection in the house. He hesitated. "Sorry, dear. You know how sweets damage teeth, especially now with your braces, once a cavity starts." Before he could finish, Hermione interrupted out of habit and rattled off the rest. "Once a cavity starts, it'll keep going until the tooth collapses. The only option is a root canal. Kill the nerve, clean the pulp thoroughly, then fill it with light-cured composite." She huffed. "I wasn't going to eat it. I just wanted to look." After she said that, she didn't even look at the chocolate frog again. She might have planned to taste it at first, but the mention of braces had made her give up the idea entirely. Lately, whenever anything about teeth came up, Hermione's mind involuntarily went to Miss Rabbit. It irritated her and made her feel oddly ashamed and indignant. Even a little divination skill, she thought, wasn't an excuse to comment on a girl's appearance. Perhaps it was the owl-delivered letter confirming the last divination, or perhaps it was visiting Diagon Alley and seeing real magic for herself. But something in Hermione had quietly shifted. Even the way she thought of Eno had changed, from that liar to somewhat capable. No matter how long the night, dawn always comes. By the river Thames, Eno woke as morning sunlight filtered into the narrow arch where he stayed. "Another bright sunny day," he murmured. He pulled back the worn linen curtain, stretched, and stepped out of the archway. Standing by the bridge, he let the golden light warm his face and closed his eyes, savoring the calm. After a quick wash, he sat on the grass and watched the Thames shimmer under the sun. Boats passing, a few pedestrians scattered along the bank. He liked this slow, easy life more and more. After a while, he rose and returned to his archway to pack. He shoved air-dried cheese and hard bread into his canvas bag, folded a dark gray blanket with holes into it, and tucked in the long-desired standard book of spells. He'd had a subtle premonition. After more than 3 months, today felt like the day he would re-enter the fantasy world. He didn't know the exact time, but the feeling had never been wrong. Minutes later, as he finished organizing, the light around him suddenly dimmed. In an instant, the warm morning turned into gloomy evening twilight. The sharp change knocked the breath from him. "Ah, choo!" Cold air struck him before he could do anything. Not again. No time to prepare. And the weather's awful. He rummaged through his pack for an old wool blanket, wrapped it around his shoulders, and only then felt slightly better. With the blanket draped over him, he looked even more like a traveling wizard. Only a pointed hat and a wand tucked into his lining were missing. Autumn had withered everything. On a long, dim, silent day, heavy clouds sagged low over the land. In the strange, bleak countryside, a lone figure appeared. Eno took advantage of the last light to survey his surroundings. Broken houses, crumbling walls, bleached dead trees. The sparse, ravaged landscape carried an indescribable melancholy. The wind rustled the treetops, and the place felt eerily quiet. He'd grown used to scenes like this. He had once wondered why some wild places were always so dilapidated, but after many trips, he'd learned to accept it. These places might look desolate, but they weren't especially dangerous, as long as you weren't greedy or meddlesome. Half an hour later, a wisp of smoke and the faint smell of baked bread reached him, and his tense shoulders relaxed. In the fantasy world, seeing houses or bonfires in the wild didn't guarantee safety. Devils and old witches could live there. But the smell of bread was a true comfort. Old witches brewed nauseating potions. They didn't bake loaves. He pushed through a bizarre forest and emerged into a scene of golden wheat fields crossed by narrow paths. A tall water wheel turned in the distance. A small town, more like a cluster of houses, lay before him. Thatched cottages, stone buildings, wooden homes, a bakery, a mill, a blacksmith, a tailor. Because it was getting late, the town was quiet, not the bustle of daytime. His slightly odd clothing drew a few stares. He didn't try to speak to anyone right away, and no one approached him. It was as if they were all engaged in a silent standoff. After walking around and gauging the place, Ino judged it a small town, another miniature settlement. That made it easier for him to rule out the kind of stories and dangers typical of large cities or of the open wilderness. 2 years of experience in the fantasy world had let him piece together its nature. The king's capital, prosperous trading cities, medium towns, small towns, villages, remote wilderness. Each was a puzzle piece of a vast world. Sometimes pieces connected, sometimes they didn't. Every place had its own story. In some places, the story had ended. In others, it hadn't even begun. Regardless, the people who lived there kept living their lives. No tavern or inn, he noted to himself. I'll have to ask for lodging. He kept walking, taking in the town that felt like a secluded paradise. Its buildings and services clearly made for the residents, as if outsiders were never meant to be considered. 9. Old John Red Shoes, Dummy Knock, the girl who trod on the loaf, the lazy spinner, the three lucky ones. Stories flickered through his mind, one after another. Eno shook his head to clear them. What he'd seen so far wasn't enough to reconstruct a whole tale. Small towns spawned countless little stories. He needed a place to stay and an entry point into the town's life, fast. Finding lodgings was the easy part. 2 years of wandering had left him with enough coppers to keep for a while. The harder task was choosing his point of approach. First, he had to settle on an identity, the one he used most often, a bard or a bard's apprentice. Then he had to pick who to talk to. Ordinary, well-kept houses and respectable folk were unlikely to lead to anything useful. He preferred odd, run-down places. In such corners, he often found scraps of the town's real business, even after a story had ended. He followed that instinct and chose the ramshackle house whose owner was just returning from a day of shoemaking. The place leaked in storms and was drafty, but it was one of the few pieces of property old John still owned. "Hello, sir," Eno said as he stepped forward. "Forgive the intrusion, but is there anywhere I might stay for a night? I'll pay." Old John froze, then looked at him with mild surprise. "You talking to me?" "Yes, I'm a wandering bard. It's late and the inn's full." Eno's practiced smile and polite tone did half the work for him. Even a stern magistrate might have believed him. An ordinary man in his 50s was no challenge at all. "A bard, eh?" Old John's face softened with a touch of nostalgia. "Well, come on in, little fellow, if you don't mind how drafty and shabby it is." "Thank you, sir," Eno replied, bowing politely. Old John snorted lightly. "Don't call me sir, I'm no master or noble. Folks around here just call me Old John. You can call me that." "In that case, all right, Old John," Eno said. "Call me Eno. Little fellow is how I was 3 years ago." A simple joke did what politeness rarely could. It bridged the gap between two strangers. Old John laughed heartily, and soon they were sitting opposite each other by a tiny kerosene lamp whose flame threatened to gutter out every moment. The little circle of light barely reached the edges of the room. "A bard's a fine trade," Old John said after a while. "When I was young, I wanted to get away too. I wasted half my life out roaming, and when I came back, I found my hometown had changed into something that didn't want me anymore." The lamplight carved lines into Old John's face as he spoke. "At least you saw something, though," Eno said. "There are people who travel and come back with nothing and no regret. That's worse, I think." Old John's gaze sharpened. "I believe you are a bard now." In more ways than one, Eno answered easily. I've got plenty of stories. I could tell you some for a fee. Old John barked a short laugh that cut off as quickly as it started. In this town, you'll come back empty-handed. That offhand remark snapped Eno's attention to full focus. He was here to collect information. Every stray sentence mattered. Do people not pay for tales here? He asked, keeping his voice casual. No, Old John said, shaking his head. This place used to be poor. People often went hungry. Only recently have things gotten a little better. Asking the folk to pay for a story? They'd laugh. If they give anything at all, it's little odds and ends, nothing of real value. From that, Eno deduced what he needed. Whatever story had unfolded here was already over. It wasn't a guess pulled from nowhere. 2 years of wandering had taught him how places changed. Significant change usually came with a story in motion. When the story ended, so did the chance for a newcomer to ride its tide to fortune. No new roads, no prosperous enterprises born out of legend, just a town settling back into ordinary life. That's fine, Eno said, feeling a quiet resignation. I won't stay long. As long as I'm alive, the road keeps moving, whether it's under my feet or in my heart. Old John tried to cheer him. Don't be so glum. People will still give you scraps if you tell stories. An old blanket, a loaf, some kitchen tools. Nothing big, but enough to get by. Eno, don't call me little fellow. Eno pretended to be offended. Ha, all right then, Old John chuckled. But you don't look so young yourself. They talked until Old John, citing his weariness, finally turned in. Late that night, Eno lay on a straw-stuffed pallet while a cold wind stitched itself through the cracks in the walls. The wind found secret holes and leaked into the room as if it had a mind of its own. He pulled a tattered blanket tighter around himself, the kind one rescued from a rich district's dumpster. It looked worse for wear, but the cashmere lining was genuine and did a good job of holding in heat. I'll do a reading tomorrow, he thought. At least the story's over. That gives me some time to read. He closed his eyes and let the night take him. In a world like this, he had learned there was no point in greed. Stories would come and go. As long as he stayed alive and kept moving, there would always be another chance. 10. The Volume of Death. The next morning, amid a clanging din, Eno reluctantly opened his eyes. He blinked a few times, then located the source of the noise. Old John was sitting outside, hammering away at something. The rhythmic clanging had woken him. Are you awake? Then get up. Don't be like those lazy drunks who sleep until noon, Old John called. Eno noticed an odd, almost hostile insistence in the old man's voice against sloth. He pushed aside his doubts, got out of bed, and fetched a towel and toothbrush from his satchel to wash up. Then he wandered outside. Old John, does anyone really have their shoes fixed so early? He asked, squatting beside the old man and eyeing the tools spread on the ground. It didn't take long to realize Old John's trade, a cobbler. Life's better now, Old John said without looking up, so fewer folks bother to repair their boots. When he finished hammering, he sighed. Still, no harm in driving in more nails. Who knows when they'll be needed? At least, no one should be barefoot in winter. Eno nodded. Too many people turn a blind eye to suffering around them. Funny how some dream of being heroes in far-off places. He wasn't flattering Old John. 2 years on the road had taught him how often suffering was ignored. Places whose stories were over slipped back into ordinary life, and ordinary life rarely produced miracles. Those forgotten places often became the ones that hurt. Old John was uncharacteristically quiet for a while, staring up at the sky. You're right, Eno, he said at last. Dreaming of being a hero and then finding you can't even save those near you, that's the real joke. He'd called him by name, dropping the usual little fellow. Eno didn't press the question. He suspected the town's story had touched Old John somehow. The man's melancholy made it clear this was not the moment to pry. Clearing his throat, Eno tried to lift the mood. My teacher once told me something. I'll pass it on. He waited until Old John seemed to return to himself, then went on slowly. Life is like a small ripple, spreading outward, so the usual state of life is, in a way, regret. After a beat, he added, but all life has light, like a burning match, faint, warm, bright. If a match can light another before it goes out, even for a moment, then that shouldn't be called regret. A long pause followed. Old John snorted. Being lectured by you, little fellow? Really? His humor came back, and the sadness that had been on his face eased. A few minutes later, he packed up his tools. I'm off to work. With any luck, we'll have a good dinner tonight. If you're bored, go up that little hill behind the town. It's safe. Kids go up there in spring to pick mushrooms. Okay, I understand, Eno said, standing to fetch his backpack. He thought ruefully that if he'd known the hill was so close when he first arrived, he might have been happier. But the curtain had fallen on whatever excitement the town had once held. The ticket was expired, only a keepsake now. On the small hill behind town, in a secluded spot where he wouldn't be seen, Eno began to practice magic with the standard book of spells. First-year Hogwarts wizards only needed to master 7 spells, but to Eno those were prefixes for countless advanced charms, like the 26 letters that could be combined into any poem. The first-year charms final in his old studies, for instance, required a pineapple to dance across a desk, a neat application of the softening charm, the levitation charm, and a locking charm in combination. Even Dumbledore's terror, Fiendfire, seemed to him an advanced expression of the same fire-making principles. A tiny flame and a raging inferno were both about summoning fire. He had thought about his future ever since the owl arrived. No matter what lay ahead, he couldn't be careless with study. If you couldn't work yourself to death, you worked yourself nearly to it. With a sigh and a rub to a sore wrist, he raised his wand and started another round. Incendio, Alohomora, Reparo. He practiced the fundamentals while his peers would be off playing Quidditch or pulling pranks. Hours slipped by unnoticed in a state of deep focus. When the light finally began to dim, he realized he had forgotten to eat. Hunger hit him all at once, raw and animal. He pulled out the dried cheese he always kept and gnawed through 2 hunks to quiet it. When he finally sat back, the sky stunned him. Sunset spread like a smear of red oil across the horizon, turning the clouds into streaks of molten color. Below, the town's clustered roofs puffed gentle plumes of cooking smoke that rose and mixed with the low clouds, as if the sky were leaning down to touch the world. From his place on the hill, Eno felt like an attentive spectator to a quiet, perfect masterwork. Chapter 11, 1 month later. Beside the town square, the story wound to its end. Later, Ali Baba told his son the secret of opening the stone door, and his son told his grandson, and so on. Their descendants prospered. Ali Baba's family treasured their good fortune and never grew extravagant, so their line flourished and was praised for generations. Eno sat on his small stool, bringing 1001 Nights to life for his audience. He was surrounded by a cluster of children, with a few older townsfolk and some adults who had a moment to spare. Amazing, Eno. Another one. Yes, tell us another. I'm not tired of your stories yet. As the applause faded and the children clamored for more, Eno simply listened. He remained calm amid the chaos, the kind of performer who wouldn't release the hawk until he had seen the rabbit. The children shuffled and scratched their ears, knowing exactly what he was waiting for, but powerless to hasten him. The impasse lasted only a few minutes, until a basket of freshly baked whole wheat loaves was set on the ground. Little Eno, another story, please. These breads should cover it, said an elderly woman with silver hair, a round, plump figure, and a faded white linen dress that always looked a little comical, Aunt Aisha. Eno glanced at the basket, made his quiet calculation, and smiled warmly. Aunt Aisha, this basket is worth at least 3 stories. He accepted the exchange honestly. Even for a few loaves he wouldn't cheat. Bards had to keep their principles. Respecting those who could and would pay was how they survived. He lifted the basket, tucked the loaves into his satchel, and handed the empty basket back. Aunt Aisha nudged him. You got your payment. Get on with it, you little rascal. Clearing his throat, Eno began. All right then. This one is about a tailor, a genie, a treasure, and a princess. Once the crowd quieted, he let the tale unspool. This happened in a very distant land, long, long ago. On the other side of town, away from the square's bustle, a quieter, older street held another scene. Under a lean-to, a tattered canvas was spread on the ground among scraps of leather, bits of velvet, and rusted nails. No customers came, yet the owner squatted there, hammering. The steady ring of metal on metal carried down the lane. Old John still kept the town's sole shoe repair stall. A month ago, he might have idled when business was slow. Now, whether rain or shine, whether anyone walked past or not, He hammered and carved shoe soles as if driven. Day after day, the same small, solitary tasks, none of them much noticed by anyone. Time slipped by in small, quiet ways. In the square, Eno's last story wound down and the crowd thinned, not because they had grown bored, but because life forced people back to work. Children had to be home for supper to help with chores. When the few stragglers had gone, Eno packed up his things and stretched. He folded his stool, shouldered his bundle, and sighed. Unbelievable. It's been a month. He ran a finger over the 31 pencil marks scratched onto his old canvas wrap. A month in this ordinary town had slipped away like water. But he had grown. Mornings were spent practicing magic in the hills behind town, afternoons telling stories at the fountain to earn food. Days were full. He could now reliably cast all 7 of the first-year spells, including the tricky levitation charm. Yet as his magic advanced, his stock of stories dwindled. An afternoon's audience demanded more than 3 or 5 short tales. He had to stretch the shorter ones. Today's Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves had become a desert epic full of scorpion venom, poisonous insects, mysterious caverns, and human cocoons, turning a few hundred words into a long, breathless performance. He could make a little last, but he could only do it by piling on details. More troubling than the vanishing stories was the sense that he hadn't found his place. Time had made the town accept him, but he hadn't truly become part of it. There was a loneliness not in the hills, but on the street, a sense of being alone in a crowd. Logically, he muttered, in a town where a story ended, I shouldn't still be here. He was used to moving on after a week or two. Yet a month had passed with no sign of returning home, and a low weariness tugged at him. He gave a small sigh and pushed his questions aside for now, one step at a time. 10 minutes later, he was at old John's house. The old man crouched by a rough hearth, fiddling with a pair of broken flints as he tried to coax a spark for supper. Old John, stop playing with the flints. We have fresh bread tonight. Old John dropped the flints and rose with a grin. I smelled it from down the lane. I wasn't sure you'd invite an old man to the table. You always act like I never feed you, Eno shot back, amused. You're the one who eats more than anyone else. A month of companionship had made easy friends of them. That evening's supper was modest and hearty. Mushroom soup with wild greens, 2 boiled eggs, and a basket of whole wheat loaves. In this town, such a meal would be considered comfortably middle class. They ate and joked as the last light drained from the street, ordinary and steady, as if the world could be held together by simple routines and shared bread. 12. Old John's story dinner was over. Eno topped up the oil lamp with kerosene until the little room was as bright as it could be. He couldn't help but sigh as he did it. The people in this small town were an interesting lot. They wouldn't pay for stories, and they charged for all sorts of odd things, this small tin of kerosene being one of the rewards he'd earned. He sat back down and said conversationally, Old John, why do you always use flint to light a fire? I don't begrudge saving, but we can afford matches. 2 packs for a copper coin. He produced the matches he'd bought that afternoon, a whole large box that by sight would last a long while. After spending so much time with the old man, he felt genuine pity. It didn't seem like much now, but what if this went on for years? No children, no savings, no way to do much work. Where would old John end up? Eno knew he could only do small things. Buy matches, try to make the old man's later years a little easier. When he set the box on the table, old John froze. There was a sudden, unnameable sadness in his eyes. Eno fell silent. He didn't have the words or the right to press. If he said the wrong thing and upset the man, that would be the last thing either of them needed. The hut settled into a careful quiet. After a long moment, the sadness drained from old John's face and was replaced by a kind of resolution. Thank you for the matches, little Eno. I'll take them, he said, his voice hoarse and softer than usual. Eno studied him for a beat, then relaxed. Good. Consider it a parting gift. You know I don't have anything more valuable to give. Parting? Old John paused, then nodded slowly. Yes, a bard isn't meant to stay in one place forever. Leaving is inevitable. I ought to have known that long ago. In that case, Eno smiled, we won't stay long. Every bard is like the wind. It flows across changing ground. Old John returned the smile, adopting the weary look of someone who'd seen a lot. Listen to me, little fellow. If you find a place and people that suit you, stay. Life can be full of passion, but it must eventually find peace. You can't wander forever. Eno didn't argue at once. He mulled it over for a few seconds before replying. You might be right. The river reaches the sea in the end, but the sea evaporates into clouds, and the rain, cold as falling stars, returns to the world again. Old John laughed and shook his head. He's arguing with a bard, he teased, then let the subject go. Eno wasn't finished. The sadness he'd seen earlier stayed with him, and he wanted to offer something more than idle words. Old John, he said, then answered his own question as if to explain, I like the sun. It's always both rising and setting at once. When it slips over the mountain at dusk, gathering the last light, somewhere else, its other side is already climbing a new peak and sending out warmth. He watched the old man carefully. Everything has two sides, Old John. Don't let habit trap you so you can't move on with your life. He fell silent. Some things are sharpest when hinted at. Saying more would only cheapen them. He resolved to pack his bags early the next morning. A few minutes passed. Just when Eno thought the night's conversation had ended, Old John let out a soft sigh. He sat across the table as if a weight had been lifted. He hadn't changed, exactly, but he looked younger somehow, his silver hair not quite so stark, like a burden had been set down. These past few days I've listened to your stories, Old John said suddenly. Would you like to hear one of mine? Eno didn't answer with words. He tugged his ear, a comic gesture meaning I'm listening. Old John chuckled at the expression, adjusted himself, and began slowly. This isn't some far-off tale. It happened right here, in this very town. There was a young man who always longed for the free world beyond. Whenever a bard passed through, he would pester them for tales of what lay outside. Old John smiled quietly as he spoke. Time went on, and eventually the young man settled. He married, a woman not beautiful perhaps, but good and virtuous, and his wanderlust calmed. He lit a cigarette, or perhaps merely closed his eyes, as if inhaling memory. But fate has ways of turning a person's life upside down. His wife died in childbirth. He gained a daughter and lost a wife, Old John continued, and his voice was thick with feeling. Everything he'd settled for unraveled. His restlessness came back. A few years later, he left the town. He entrusted his 5-year-old daughter to his younger brother and walked away. He coughed, short, ragged, and his eyes flashed with regret. He told the rest in halting pieces. He had no idea how his brother would change. After their old mother passed, the brother took to drink. He grew careless and idle. To feed his habits, he made the little girl go out in the winter barefoot to sell matches so he could buy drink. At that, Old John's voice broke. Tears shone in the corners of his eyes. Eno sat very still. The story, it matched a familiar, well-worn tale, the little match girl. The pieces clicked into place. He saw, with a cold clarity, what Old John had been describing. The man who left his daughter, the one who had abandoned her, and the life he'd had. Eno realized painfully that Old John was speaking about his own past, the father who had fled and been gone for over 20 years. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the lamp. Old John had finished his story, but not his confession. Time passed in slow, even breaths. Finally, Eno spoke, low and steady. Old John, I have a story about matches too. Would you like to hear it? 13. Old John's Gift. The moon was bright and the stars few. Tonight the moonlight seemed especially clear, draping the small town in a silver hush. From Old John's weathered house on the corner came the familiar lilted cadence of a bard's voice. Inside, Eno was telling the story of the little match girl with vivid detail. In the cold, long night, the little girl struck the first match. It flared warm and bright, like a tiny candle, and for a moment she felt as if she were sitting by a great iron stove, the corners gleaming with brass, he narrated. She struck all her matches. The light lit up her world, and in that brightness she saw her loving grandmother again, the kind old woman who had passed. Grandma, please take me away. When the light goes out, everything will disappear, the little girl begged as she ran toward her grandmother. And this time, Eno continued, the grandmother in the light did not vanish. She held the little girl tight. They walked across a bridge of light into a garden without hunger or cold, a place of endless ease. When Eno finished after more than 10 minutes, Old John did not cry as might have been expected. He showed no choking up. Instead, there was a quiet relief, a faint consolation. "Little Eno," he said, repeating words the boy had once spoken to him a month ago. "You told me then, all life has light, like a burning match, faint, warm, brilliant. If, before that light goes out, it can illuminate others, then it should not be called a regret." Old John let the sentence hang, each word spoken with weight. "Do you know how much comfort those words gave me? My daughter's life was brilliant. She used her days to light others, even the man she tentatively called her dear uncle. After the tragedy, he gave up the bottle and started a new life in another city." Hearing this, Eno took up the thread decisively. The Redeemer and the redeemed both find new life. The Redeemer's life is truly splendid, not something to regret. "You're right," Old John said, resolve in his voice. "So I want to make up for my mistakes. I want to use what's left of my life to light others, be a real redeemer." "So that's why you've been hammering shoe nails and making souls all this time?" Eno asked. It wasn't hard to see the change in Old John over the past weeks. "I'm a shoemaker, nothing else I can do. But when I returned, I learned that on the day my daughter died, she was barefoot, and her only garment was an apron left by her grandmother," Old John answered. The memory broke his composure for a moment. Sorrow creased his face. "So I thought, with this small skill, I'll make sure those who are barefoot have shoes. Even if I only help one person, I'll be content. No matter how long the night, morning always comes." Eno woke tired. He'd talked with Old John until midnight. He had to be up early to leave, and the prospect of heading home cleared the last of his sleep. "Time to go back," he thought as he packed. "Feels like I didn't earn much, only honed my storytelling." He counted his gains anyway: 3 baskets of baked bread, several large sacks of mushrooms, 2 small jars of kerosene, dried wild greens, bits of cloth, a miscellaneous pile, useful but not the coins he really wanted. Looking at the jumble, he decided not to carry any of it and resolved to leave everything to Old John. After breakfast, Old John surprised him by staying home instead of heading out to work. He studied Eno's neatly packed bag. "Leaving today?" Old John asked. "Yes, today." Eno answered casually, then gestured to the pile. "Everything here is yours. Don't refuse. Gear like that is a burden for a traveler, and bandits love heavy packs." Old John wanted to refuse, but at the mention of bandits, he silently accepted. "In that case, I should give you something in return, so folk don't say Old John took advantage," he mumbled, and shuffled over to an old cabinet, propped lopsidedly on stones. He rummaged and produced a small linen pouch that jingled. From the sound, Eno knew it contained at least silver. Copper coins would not sound so clear. Beside it lay a very old matchbox, edges charred from use. Eno showed no disdain. He took the matches carefully. "Thank you. I like this very much," he said. Then he looked at the money bag and shook his head. "No one is richer than a bard. Our coins are hidden in our minds. Isn't that safer?" He refused the pouch firmly yet gently. He felt a twinge of guilt, for who wouldn't want treasure within reach? But in their world, greed often invited trouble. Before Old John could speak, Eno lifted the matches. "I already have the most precious gift. I can't be greedy for more." His voice was honest. There was no pretense. In a world of strange magics and hidden meanings, appearances were often misleading. The small matchbox felt like a key, an object that linked 2 stories, something special beyond its humble look. Old John studied Eno's amber eyes as he spoke and saw no scorn, only sincere joy. Clearly, Eno truly liked the gift. "To be honest," Old John admitted, "I never meant to give you that. My gift was the bag of coins." He untied the rough rope binding the pouch and let the coins spill softly. Their color caught the light. Neither man lingered over them, though. For Eno, who had seen far greater treasures, a small pouch of coins held little sway. For Old John, it explained the town's small mystery, how he managed, with no notable trade, to live comfortably for years since he returned. The answer lay in that pouch. They stood a moment in the quiet kitchen, 2 very different lives touching briefly over a box of old matches and a bag of coins. Then Eno hoisted his pack, shouldered himself for the road, and with a final nod left Old John's house behind, the night's moonlight still silvering the town as if it had wrapped everything in a fragile, gentle promise. 14. Departure and return. Old John retied the money bag with a length of rope after confirming that Eno truly had no interest in the gold coins. Thank you for last night's story. It made me change my mind. As you might guess, these are the matches my daughter left behind, her only memento. Eno noticed the change in the old man. Compared with the relief he'd felt the previous night after unburdening himself, old John now seemed reborn, as if he had found salvation. Even when he mentioned his daughter's keepsake, there was no trace of the regret and sorrow that had haunted him before. But you gave me a big pack of new matches. I wanted to leave this to you, and to have the tale of the matchstick girl spread through these parts. Old John laughed, a deep, hearty sound that seemed to cut through the sky. Outside the town, the gravel road narrowed to a single track, barely wide enough for one carriage. It was the only road that led to the nearby city. Old John, this is far enough, really, Eno said gently. After a month of living together, he understood the old man's mood all too well. That look was painfully familiar, like the way an elderly relative stands at the gate when a visiting family member leaves after the New Year holiday. From the doorstep to the village boundary, even after the carriage had driven far away, the old woman would stay put, unwilling to move. All right, I'm off on a new journey now, chasing the footsteps of spring. And you, begin your story too. I hope I'll still hear your legends from afar. Goodbye, old John. To ease the ache of parting, Eno called his farewell and then, without looking back, stepped onto the long gravel road. Old John didn't answer. He only stood and waved his weathered arm as if to complete the ritual. After a while, Eno heard an odd, distant recitation behind him. It was old John's voice, rough but measured, in the cadence of a traveling bard. The tone was deep and resonant. Even at that distance, Eno could clearly hear the words, a blessing for a traveler heading far from home. London, by the Thames. Eno had returned to his original world, planning only to make lunch, rest a little, then go out for supplies in the afternoon. He never expected to find something hidden in his satchel when he opened it, old John's money bag full of gold coins. The discovery left him unsure whether to laugh or cry. He had been determined not to accept money, and yet here it was, quietly placed in his bag without his noticing. He was touched and relieved both. Had he realized the gift at the time, he would have insisted on refusing it, but because he hadn't, old John had managed to do what he thought best. This accidental acquisition solved an immediate problem perfectly. Not only had he circumvented the rules of the wizarding world and come into a bag of gold, but he'd avoided the slow growth of greed, two benefits at once. As for old John's future, Eno wasn't worried. In the town's small puzzle of lives and stories, the old man had a way of turning danger into safety. Even if everyone else were to vanish, old John would manage. Thank you, old John, Eno murmured, looking at the coins. He slid the money bag into the inner pocket of his coat and began planning. He would sell the second-hand items he'd collected and replace them with new ones, especially that plain, worn robe that had acquired a patina he didn't like. If money weren't tight, he wouldn't have touched it, even if it had been thrown on the ground. A new robe, a new cauldron, maybe even a room at the leaky cauldron. He ran numbers in his head, trying to figure the exchange at Gringotts. A full bag of gold should, he estimated, be more than enough to get him to graduation, provided he didn't waste it. Diagon Alley. This time, Eno walked leisurely instead of rushing. He hadn't forgotten his purpose. His first stop was Gringotts. The marble hall was as imposing as ever, and behind the counters the goblins, short, efficient faces, were at their endless work, weighing coins and inspecting gems through monocles. Eno approached a counter and produced one of old John's gold coins. The distinct chime of metal set the goblin opposite into a servile attentiveness. Certainly, honored guest. Gringotts' exchange rates are always open and transparent, the goblin said. That's good, Eno replied, placing the coin on the counter. My time is valuable, so please be quick. His tone carried a touch of arrogance, but the goblin regarded him with a knowing look. Although the young wizard was simply dressed, there was a calm, confident manner about him that marked him as different from many pure-blood children. The goblin set to work, checking color, weight, hardness. After a series of tests, it was certain. The coin was pure gold, and it looked like an antique. If traded simply for its bullion value, but if treated as an artifact, greed won out. The goblin gave a careful appraisal. The purity is excellent, and the total weight comes to 1.2 ounces. This coin can be exchanged for 145 galleons. Eno did an instant calculation in his head. Based on the gold price he'd checked before coming, about $350 per ounce in 1991, and a dollar to pound rate of 1.95, the quoted sum equated to over 800 British pounds. It seemed fair. He took 2 more gold coins from his pocket. "Exchange these too," he said. The casual gesture made the goblin uneasy. After a moment's hesitation, it leaned in and whispered, "Actually, if you can tell me the coin's history, it might be considered an antique and—" "No need." Eno cut him off. He'd thought about that possibility. Inventing a false provenance for a bit more money would be foolish. A few extra galleons were not worth drawing attention to an otherwise unremarkable item. Just exchange them for their gold value. 15. Platform 90 course. Coming out of Gringotts with nearly 500 galleons in his pocket, Eno felt a little giddy. Money couldn't buy everything the soul needed, but having it brought a small, unmistakable satisfaction. This was the largest sum he'd ever had since stepping into the wizarding world. In the past 2 years, his best luck had only ever yielded a few miserable silver coins. The thought of being able to spend freely made him reckless with plans. New high-quality robes tailored to fit, bottles of ink, a proper pet, and an instrument. 2 hours later, he stood outside the leaky cauldron with a brown vintage suitcase in his hand, grinning to himself. The shopping had been a thrill. He'd spent almost 200 galleons on everything on the Hogwarts supply list. Robes, textbooks, quills, the little odds and ends a new student needs, and had splurged 10 galleons on an enchanted accordion that could learn and play melodies by itself. A bard without a proper instrument would be a joke. This made him feel like a professional. But the priciest single purchase wasn't clothing or music. It was the leather case he now carried, a trace charm extension trunk, properly licensed by the ministry. It only doubled the case's own space, but it had cost him a whopping 150 galleons. He scowled at the receipt. Procedures and approvals were often worth more than the thing itself. Still, for a wandering traveler, the extra enchanted space was priceless. It made daily life easier and promised a little extra security for future trips into the unknown. Evening. He returned to the little room above the pub and, after a few days getting things in order, settled his affairs. He rented a room at the Leaky Cauldron for 2 months. No need to be foolish and sleep under a bridge when he could afford better now. Time, as always, kept moving with its odd rhythms, suddenly urgent, then leisurely. 2 months blinked past. On the morning of September 1st, 1991, Eno packed his belongings into the trace-charmed case, took one last look at the room that had been home for 2 months, and left. He bade Old Tom a quick farewell and hailed a cab to King's Cross, paying £7 for the fare. King's Cross was sprawling and busy. It was nothing like the tidy, filmic snapshots he'd half expected. No obvious glowing arches or obvious signposts. The station covered a huge area, and it took him nearly 10 minutes of wandering to find Platform 9. Along the way, he caught glimpses of familiar faces. A girl who looked nervously like Hermione standing by her parents, unsure what to say. A boy with round black glasses carrying a snowy white owl. He pretended not to notice. They were headed for different kinds of trouble. When he finally reached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, he watched a few teenagers vanish confidently through the solid wall, and then, without thinking twice, he charged through himself. Platform 9 force unfolded like something out of a storybook. Medieval arches, an old steam engine, and scarlet and black carriages scuffed by 100 years of use. The moment he passed through the barrier, a faint, familiar weightlessness washed over him. The same odd, hollow feeling that came with stepping into the magical world. He barely had time to savor it. Immediately the platform assaulted him with a roar, the hiss of the steam engine, parents shouting last-minute warnings, the high laughter and teasing of students, and a chorus of pets making incomprehensible noises. The sudden flood of sound made him want to retreat. He made a mental note. Learn a silencing charm. He hadn't expected London to be this packed. Pulling his case close, he threaded through the crowd toward the train. He remembered that the Hogwarts Express had compartments, Finding one early and closing the door promised a pocket of quiet. As he walked, several older girls tried to strike up conversation. He ignored them. This wasn't the Muggle world. Older students around here had dangerous charms at their disposal. Love potions, confundus, even Imperius crossed his mind. Their bold, hungry looks unnerved him more than any spell. Their eyes were the sort that belonged to someone looking at a fluffy pet they wanted to take home. He was not in the mood for being admired. He found an empty compartment and slipped inside. The door closed with a soft bang. For a moment, the small wooden room, magically soundproof, whatever the reason, became utterly quiet. The contrast felt like stepping into a calm after a storm. Enclosed spaces always felt safe to him. They were like cardboard boxes to children, the perfect place to curl up and breathe. He let out a long, grateful breath. Thank the English stiff upper lip and traditional restraint, he thought with a smile. If he'd boarded at Beauxbatons or Trimagis, his pockets might already be full of little notes and ribbon tokens. Here, at least, the attention was a little more measured. Safe in the little compartment with his case by his feet, Eno settled back and watched the platform blur into motion as the engine prepared to leave. The journey was beginning, and with it a new chapter. Books to buy, lessons to learn, and a world to explore. Time passed by the second. At 10:30 a.m., the old steam engine gave one final roar before setting off. A cloud of white steam rose over the platform, and the young witches and wizards hurried onto the train. On the far side of the platform, Mrs. Weasley was giving her usual warning. Today's target was her youngest son, Ron, who was about to start school. Ron, you must study hard at Hogwarts. Don't be like George and Fred, causing trouble all the time. Do you hear me? Having heard versions of this speech his whole life, Ron nodded politely and supplied the obligatory reply. Okay, Mum, I'll stay away from George and Fred. If I need someone to look up to, I'll go to Percy. Make Percy my role model. That'll do, Mrs. Weasley sighed in relief. She had 7 children. She'd long since learned to accept the performances they gave her. Compared to George and Fred, at least Ron's answer sounded sensible, for now. September 1st, 1991, 11 a.m. The Hogwarts Express left Platform 9 and 3/4 on time. Inside one compartment, Eno leaned against the window and watched the countryside blur as the old train shuddered into speed. He couldn't help smirking. Express? Ha! I don't know where it gets the confidence. He doubted whether the relic could even manage 30 kilometers an hour. A sharp knock. The compartment door swung open. There's only one person here. We'll kick him out and take the whole compartment, a heavy voice announced. Eno looked up. He wasn't trying to hog the compartment. Trains without assigned seats ran on the usual first-come, first-served basis. But he wasn't about to be bullied either. Being new in a strange place, he knew it'd be worse to let himself be pushed around. He set his wand down on the table with a loud slap. The noise made the big oaf at the doorway flinch. Another voice, cool and cultivated, cut across the moment. Goyle, step aside. I've told you before, always remember your bearing. We have to look the part. The heavy one, Goyle, sidled away, and a pale boy with platinum hair and a neat, slicked-back style came into view. Draco Malfoy. Malfoy, Eno said, unsurprised. Draco Malfoy. Who are you, then? Malfoy did not rush to shove anyone out. He regarded Eno with a measured look. Swinburne, Eno said calmly when Malfoy hesitated. Swinburne? I don't remember that name among the English pure-blood families. Are you foreign? Perhaps, Eno replied with a half-smile. I've wandered enough. I haven't exactly been staying in one homeland. Malfoy studied him, then offered an opinion. You look German, and your eyes are unusual. Malfoy's assumptions were the sort that came from noticing features and assigning them to lineages. Eno let him talk. There was little sense in declaring himself one thing or another straight away. A little ambiguity made life easier. I don't mind where I'm from, Eno said after a moment. My name or origin doesn't make me nobler than anyone else. True nobility is about surpassing your former self. He'd picked up a knack for saying the right thing in the right tone. A couple of years as a bard had taught him how to be eloquent when it mattered. Malfoy smiled, then extended his hand. I'm fairly certain we're the same sort, he said, as if that explained everything. Eno didn't accept the handshake like a bootlicker, but he didn't rudely refuse it either. A polite grip and a cool note in his voice were better than making an enemy of the only fashionable boy on the train. "If you can't find another compartment, you're welcome to sit here," Malfoy added. "But don't get any ideas about kicking people out." "You needn't worry about that," Malfoy said, dismissing the heavy-set boy with a flick of his wrist. "Goyle's never been the sharpest. Don't take him seriously." Malfoy pulled Goyle closer and patted him on the shoulder. Goyle stood there smiling foolishly, not exactly the picture of menace. Eno couldn't help laughing at the tableau. Since he didn't want to press things, he repeated the invitation. "Don't just stand in the doorway. If you'd come on board earlier, you might have found an empty compartment. It's better to have somewhere to sit than stand." Malfoy accepted without ceremony, sitting beside Eno and motioning for his two followers to move their trunks. The compartment settled into an easy conversation. Despite Malfoy's reputation, the 11-year-old didn't seem inherently cruel. He was less severe than Crabbe, and his banter was more theatrical than vicious. The atmosphere grew friendlier as they chatted. "Eno," Malfoy asked after a while, "I've heard the boy who lived is on this train. Want to come see him with me?" "In person? I'd rather read," Eno said. He'd learned that following crowds to stare at famous people rarely ended well. "Suit yourself. You look more like a Ravenclaw bookworm than a Slytherin," Malfoy teased, grinning. He and his companions left the compartment then, Malfoy closing the wooden door gently behind them. The train, after half an hour's warming up, finally picked up speed. The view outside the window smoothed from jerky glimpses into a steady, rolling panorama. After their conversation, Eno had a better idea of who Draco Malfoy was. Flashy and confident, certainly, but not a brute. He settled back with a book as the Hogwarts Express sped toward the castle. 17. A small test. After Malfoy and his two companions left, Eno leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He had been up since 8 that morning and had been going non-stop, so a short nap to recover his energy seemed sensible before the sorting ceremony that evening. He dismissed the thought of Harry's forced sorting. He preferred to let fate decide where the hat would place him. He also remembered Snape's mention of occlumency and thought this would be a good chance to test it. Could the sorting hat still carry on a proper conversation if someone was blocking their thoughts? Outside the carriage window, fields blurred past. Neat farmland gave way to dense forest, winding rivers, and rolling green hills. Time slipped away. Hours passed in a flash. When Eno opened his eyes, it was fully dark. Mountains and trees cut jagged silhouettes against a violet sky. He couldn't tell where they were. He had slept on and off from noon until dusk. He glanced back at the compartment. Malfoy had been sulking ever since midday, wearing an expression that shouted, "I'm miserable." He looked like someone whose online fantasy had been shattered the moment they met the object of their obsession in person. Maybe at first, Malfoy had wanted to be friends with Harry, but he'd forgotten one of life's cruelties. It's possible to love someone and resent them at the same time. 5 minutes until we arrive at Hogwarts. Please leave your luggage on the train. It will be sent to the school for you. The carriage announcement cut through his thoughts, and the train visibly slowed. 10 minutes later, a conductor called. "The train has stopped. If you don't get off and miss the welcome feast, we'll only see you next year." Eno shrugged at the three beside him and headed for the door. He didn't have any deep friendship with Malfoy, only the brief acquaintance from the carriage, and the crowd on the platform didn't interest him. He pushed the compartment door open and stepped into a corridor now full of young witches and wizards, all jostling toward the exits. His compartment was toward the rear, so he could drift with the flow rather than get wedged in the center. Hogsmeade Station was small and old. "First years this way! First years over here! Harry, come here!" On the platform, Eno saw the giant of a man, Hagrid, waving a lantern. The orange magical flame burned bright in the dark, picking out Hagrid's tangled beard and immense frame. The first years gathered like fish in a stream and began to follow him up a steep, narrow path. The ground was slick from rain. They had to watch their footing and the vines twisting underfoot. It was a stumbling, slipping procession, with only Hagrid's lantern to cut through the black. Eno couldn't help wondering why the road to the most magical school in Britain was so miserably dark. Halloween could be full of floating pumpkins and lights. Why not here? He raised his wand and murmured, Incendio. A steady flame sprang to life at the tip of his wand and swelled into a fist-sized torch, hovering at the wand's tip. Years of practice finally paid off. The warm light pushed back the immediate gloom, and suddenly the path ahead and the faces around him were visible. Swinburne, someone murmured from behind. Eno glanced back, but could only make out a shadow. It had to be one of two girls he knew here, Hermione, whom he'd seen during divination earlier, or Hannah, the iron-capped prince he had met at the Leaky Cauldron. He couldn't see clearly, but the torchlight limited his own field of vision. Anyone with wilderness experience knew that holding a torch helps others at the cost of your own sight. The little torch drew attention. People instinctively closed in, and soon a cluster of pupils were craning toward the light. "Don't push! Hey! Don't cling to me!" Eno scolded as he tried to maintain a gap. Panic touched his skin at the thought of a stampede. If anyone were trampled because of him, he joked to himself, he'd skip Hogwarts and end up at Azkaban for further studies. He managed to restore some order and let out a breath. "Quiet, little ones, around this bend and you'll see Hogwarts for the first time." Hagrid's voice lifted everyone's spirits. A few minutes later, they came to the edge of a black lake. On the far slope, a vast castle rose into the night, its turrets and windows glittering like stars. Small boats bobbed at the shore. "No more than 4 to a boat," Hagrid called. Eno was the first to step into one of the boats. The example encouraged others, though there was the usual scramble. Hagrid made a final sweep of the shore, grinned at them, and clambered into the last boat. "Off we go." The boat slid across the glassy surface of the lake without a breeze, heading straight for the castle. As they crossed, a familiar voice broke through the quiet. "Did you just use the fire-making spell?" On the boat beside him, Hermione's sharp tone cut in. Eno recognized her at last. "Miss Granger? Was my divination earlier accurate?" he asked. "I'm asking about your spell just now," Hermione snapped. "Never mind the divination. Yes, I'm pleased with the reading, but that doesn't excuse you charging me." "You charged me," Eno protested. "You took my money." "You charged me £1 for a reading," Hermione said, cheeks flushing. Someone has to be responsible for a divination." "Stingy," Eno grumbled, more amused than offended. Hermione bit her lip, genuinely irritated. It wasn't what she'd expected. She hadn't thought a conversation would revert to that measly £1 so quickly. The boat continued to glide on, and the castle grew larger with every sweep of the oars. The sorting ceremony and the small experiments waiting for it, occlumency and the hat's judgment, were only hours away. Chapter 18. Hello, Hogwarts. The little boat drifted quietly across the black lake. Eno was grateful for the calm after Hermione had gone silent for a moment. Compared with Malfoy, he had no desire to get tangled up with someone like her, so central to everything, but that peace didn't last long. After only a few minutes, the brown-haired girl beside him began muttering to herself again. "I clearly already forgot that. And besides, our meeting here, doesn't that explain everything?" It sounded like a reluctant surrender, and Eno was still inclined to stay quiet. This girl could be relentless, but Hermione wasn't about to stop. She stared at the water, then suddenly spoke up in a sharp, almost accusing voice. "Yes, your divination was spot on, and £1 as payment is nothing. You deserve it, Mr. Swinburne." The high-pitched exclamation startled him. There was a hint of grievance and a slight quaver to her tone. "All right," Eno said. In the circumstances, staying silent would have felt like bullying a child. "What I used back there was the fire-making spell." "I knew it," Hermione exclaimed. "The illuminating charm is white light, and orange can only be the fire-making spell. But how did you make it stay on your wand? I tried it over the summer, and it was like, well, a not very bright lighter." She had perked up completely, rattling off her observations with the eagerness of someone who loved facts. "The fire-making spell's purpose is to give a wizard a flame whenever needed," Eno replied. "Calling it a lighter is not a bad comparison." He slowed his voice deliberately. He'd noticed that whenever Hermione spoke, she kept both hands clutched at her robes, a small sign of tension. Thinking about it, it made sense. An 11-year-old girl away from home in a strange place would be nervous. The thought softened him. He felt a little ashamed of his earlier coldness. Miss Granger, you've read the Standard Book of Spells, haven't you? He asked, keeping his tone gentle. When it came to the use of words, no one was better than a bard at controlling conversation. Even as an apprentice, Eno had a good sense of pacing. In a few sentences, he'd managed to relax her. Call me Hermione. And yes, I finished the Standard Book of Spells over the summer, she said proudly. Time slipped by in conversation. The small boat slid through the curtain of ivy covering the cliff face and came to a stone platform. Hagrid had organized everyone to follow a pebble path for a few minutes, and finally they reached the castle. Hagrid rapped his huge fist on the massive oak door. Bang, bang, bang. The door opened from the inside, and a tall, thin witch stepped out. Where some people naturally inspired laughter and others commanded respect, Professor McGonagall's stern silence did both. Her emerald robes and pointed hat did nothing to soften the severe set of her face, and the young witches and wizards felt the weight of her authority all at once. The lively noise from moments before died away. Thank you, Hagrid. I'll take it from here, she said, her voice clipped. As deputy head of Gryffindor, she knew these children well. A strong first impression would save a lot of trouble later. First, welcome to Hogwarts. She said it sharply, and with a quick flick of her wand, the towering oak doors swung wide, opening like a lion baring its jaws. The sight hushed the group completely. Eno noticed a small, chubby boy nearby who looked on the verge of tears. It was hard not to admire Professor McGonagall. She had the new students exactly where she wanted them. Now, stay quiet and follow me. She turned and walked toward the castle. Instinctively, the children fell into a single file behind her, following without a sound or a stray glance. They reached the antechamber to the Great Hall. The start of term feast is about to begin, Professor McGonagall announced, addressing them with the formality of a teacher introducing an important lesson. But first you must be sorted into your houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. There is no superiority among the houses. Each has its own proud history and has produced many fine witches and wizards. Her gaze swept over the new pupils, then she continued more solemnly. The sorting is a Hogwarts tradition and one of the most important moments of your lives. It will shape your years here, your studies, and your life for the next 7 years. Now, wait here quietly for a moment. I must prepare for the sorting ceremony. Remember, wait quietly. Professor McGonagall left, and the newcomers exhaled all at once. The pressure of her presence had been intense. Now that she was gone, they relaxed. Children were restless by nature, and after a few minutes the antechamber hummed with whispered conversation. At first tentative, their voices grew braver as no one seemed to be watching. Eno, which house do you want to be in? Hermione asked. I want Gryffindor. Dumbledore's a Gryffindor, the greatest wizard of his age. Ravenclaw would be good too. The book says only truly clever people get sorted into Ravenclaw. Eno rubbed his temples at her chatter. She'd talked the whole way from the boats and didn't seem to have run out of words. I don't know, he said. I don't really mind, as long as they don't skip me a year. Her eyes widened as if he'd revealed some great secret. Skip a year? Hogwarts is a 7-year school. Can you skip years? That's something for later. Think about the present. He was already regretting having started this conversation. Hermione wasn't one to drop a line once she'd bitten into it. But the future is also the present later, so what exactly does skipping grades mean? There's no record of that in Hogwarts history, she pressed. Just then, Professor McGonagall returned to the antechamber. No words were necessary, one icy look from her, and every mouth shut as if a spell had been cast. The room went utterly still. Now, everyone, form a single line and follow me. The new students filed in obediently, single file behind Professor McGonagall, and stepped into the great hall one by one. They were greeted by a magical, magnificent sight. Long house tables lined with older students, hundreds of floating candles giving warm light, and an enchanted ceiling that mimicked the sky. The whole place felt solemn enough to put anyone on edge. Even Eno, who had seen more than a few dramatic scenes in his life, felt a little pressure. Being watched from every direction, and by the professors at the head table, made the moment awkward. He took a moment to steady himself, then allowed himself a quick, appreciative glance at the ceiling. The Sorting Hat's arrival drew the most interest. a relic that had been passed down for generations, with memory and will of its own. What else could be more intriguing for a new student than a talking, singing hat? The hat's song left the newcomers entranced and somewhat speechless, and then McGonagall, having waited patiently, unrolled her parchment. "Now, when I call your name, please come forward." "Hannah Abbott." A timid blonde girl with twin pigtails stepped out of the line. Ino recognized her from the leaky cauldron. She was warm and story-loving, the sort who would immediately make friends. He'd noticed, too, that the innkeeper, old Tom, watched strangers like a man who'd been guarding his coins for a long time. Hannah sat, the hat settled on her head, and the ceremony got fully underway. Because his surname came late in the alphabet, Eno had the luxury of watching the whole show. Harry's awkward moment under the hat, Malfoy slipping into Slytherin, Neville's nervousness, Seamus's explosive excitement, and of course, Hermione being placed in Gryffindor just as one would expect. One small practical detail caught him. When a student was sorted, their robe's collar and cuffs instantly changed to match the house colors. It explained why no one was buying plain robes and sewing on house colors afterward. The list thinned. Fewer and fewer names remained. Eno Swinburne. He walked forward without hurry, a polite smile on his face. His neat posture and clear eyes earned a few admiring glances from those who liked good looks. The deans at the head table, McGonagall among them, looked pleased. Severus Snape, however, who had watched the ceremony with an indifferent air, now gave a thin, cold sneer, as if the whole affair amused him. Eno tried to look innocent, curious to see how the hat would handle him. "Relax, it's nothing," McGonagall murmured reassuringly before he sat. He thanked her and settled onto the stool, concentrating inwardly. The hat barely brushed the tips of his hair before it blurted out in a high voice, "Slytherin." A roar of applause rose from the Slytherin table. Young girls in green clapped so hard their palms reddened. Eno's heart dropped. He'd hoped for anonymity. Instead, the hat's instantaneous decision drew attention. Everyone had seen new students being sorted, but he'd never seen the hat decide so abruptly. Malfoy had at least worn the hat a beat longer. He trudged to the Slytherin table with his head down, imagining the looks he would receive. Dumbledore's thoughtful gaze, Quirrell's flicker of curiosity, perhaps even the shadow of something else. He didn't think any of them were evil in their core. This was a world of complicated loyalties, but he did not want to become anyone's special interest so early. All he wanted now was to sit, blend in, and keep a low profile for the first few weeks. If trouble did break out and drew the headmaster's attention elsewhere, maybe he could slip by unnoticed. Chapter 20. Pansy Parkinson. Eno kept his head down the whole way, ignoring the curious looks as he made his way to the Slytherin table. He sat without ceremony and heard the familiar drawl beside him. "I knew it. I just knew on the train you'd be in Slytherin." He didn't want to answer, didn't want to indulge Malfoy. "Tch, there you go again," Malfoy said lightly. "Don't think I don't know what you're thinking. Besides, decorum's for show," he added with a smirk. "Now be quiet." Eno merely glanced toward the high table and mouthed for him to hush. The sorting ceremony had just ended. Professor Dumbledore stood and smiled at the students, spreading his arms as if nothing pleased him more than seeing everyone gathered. "Welcome, welcome everyone to Hogwarts for a new school year. Before the feast begins, allow me to say a few words, which are nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. Thank you all." He sat down to applause and a swirl of whispered speculation about what those words might mean. Eno had no interest in the debate. He was far more concerned with the food: roast beef, pork chops, whole roast chickens, bacon and ham, fried lamb cutlets, chips, boiled and baked potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, peas, carrots, gravy, bread, and that was just what sat within arm's reach. The long tables went on, laden with countless other dishes. Across from him, a red-haired new student was tearing into 2 chicken legs as if he'd never eaten before. Eno shook his head, selected a few things from his own plate, and began to eat at a leisurely pace. A crisp voice cut through. "You know that pure-blood degenerate?" Eno looked up despite himself. "Are you talking to me?" The little snakes around him stopped eating at once. "Parkinson, Pansy Parkinson," the voice repeated. Pansy Parkinson had short, dark hair cropped near her ears, pale skin, and a delicate face that somehow still held a sharpness. "Eno Swinburne," she said, and he set his fork down out of courtesy. His impression of Pansy was mostly colored by stories, the girl who pined for Malfoy for years in the original tale and ended up with another's pity. Now, though, the feast was not the time for nostalgia. He'd felt eyes sweeping over him since they'd entered the hall, and the attention had only grown. At Hogwarts, I only know a few people, he said coolly, and you weren't one of them earlier. May I quietly finish my dinner now, Miss Parkinson? He lowered his head and resumed his steak. The table fell momentarily silent. Outwardly, everything was polite. What he didn't see was the ripple of admiration among several Slytherin girls at his bluntness. Time passed. Plates vanished under enchantment as the last students set their cutlery down. Professor Dumbledore rose again and had everyone's attention. Now that you have eaten, a few reminders for the year ahead, he said. First years, the forbidden forest behind the castle is off limits. That rule applies to everyone. His gaze flicked toward the Gryffindor table, where Fred and George shared a look that was all innocence. Our caretaker, Mr. Filch, asked me to remind you that using magic in the corridors between classes is prohibited. He's added 127 items to the list of forbidden items. Those interested can consult him. Quidditch tryouts will be held in the second week of term. Anyone wishing to try out for their house teams should contact Madam Hooch. He paused before his last announcement. Finally, and most importantly, anyone who wishes to avoid unfortunate accidents, pain, or an untimely death should not approach the corridor to the right of the fourth floor. The Great Hall dropped into an uneasy silence. First years were genuinely frightened. Older students exchanged surprised looks at the uncharacteristic bluntness of the warning. Many shrugged. The fourth floor corridor had always been a place to avoid, and most had crossed it dozens of times without trouble. Eno thought it odd the headmaster would put a warning so bluntly before everyone, like a trap bait hung in full view. It seemed intended more to lure than to warn. Now, before you go to bed, let us sing the school song together. With a flick of his wand, Dumbledore produced a shimmering golden ribbon that unfurled into the lyrics. Everyone choose your favorite tune, he said. Ready, sing! Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hogwarts. Eno trailed along with the Slytherin contingent, wearing a guarded expression. The Slytherins took great pride in not singing out of tune, and the chorus of melodies, some jaunty, some funeral, grated on him. He had the sudden urge to cover his ears and flee, but he kept his composure as the school song filled the hall and the new year settled around them.